Hello everyone, my name is Alex Imrie. I'm a tutor of classics at the University of Edinburgh. Before I begin, I'd just like to extend my warmest thanks to Anthony Smart and to the public events team at York St John for laying on this series and bringing together such a fantastic collection of academics and scholars, of which I certainly am a comparative minnow. Now, today I'm going to be giving you something of a whistle-stop introduction to the Severan era and some of its big themes. It's altogether fitting that I should be giving this presentation as part of a series based out of York, Iberacum, since this city actually housed the Severan imperial court between the years of 208 CE and 211, with the dynasty's founder, Septimius Severus, actually dying there. So before we get into it, what do I actually mean when I say the Severan era? Some of you local to York might have come across the Severans or be somewhat familiar with them, but it's fair to say that the dynasty remains one of the lesser known ones in the public imagination, the collective imagination, particularly compared to the likes of the Julio-Claudians with Caligula or Nero, or even later rulers such as Diocletian or Constantine, another emperor with connections to York as it happens. On this slide, I've given some key details about the era to set the scene. Feel free to pause the video here if you'd like to read them at a more leisurely pace. When we say the Severan era, we refer to a period of around 40 years at the close of the 2nd century CE and into the 3rd century, when the family and relations of Septimius Severus ruled the empire. A brief handout with a family tree and timeline of key events should be available to you. The family is noteworthy in part owing to its African and Syrian origins. Until that moment, no one from either of these regions had held the ultimate power within the Roman state. You'll often hear Severus referred to as the African emperor, in quotes, and questions of the family's ethnicity and heritage continue to be points of discussion in both academic and popular circles. Now, the Severan era is an unquestionably violent period, even by Roman standards. The dynasty rises and falls through military bloodshed. The flow of the dynasty is almost dead-ended by a usurper snatching power in the year 217. Of the 5 Severan men to hold the title of Augustus, that is to say, emperor, 4 of them die violent deaths. The later half of the dynasty is marked by the rule of boy emperors, overseen by prominent imperial women, who are often salaciously characterized as negative influences on their young charges. The death of the final emperor in 235 without an heir is a seminal moment in Roman imperial history. It's followed by around half a century of civil upheaval and conflict in what is commonly referred to as the 3rd century crisis. So what makes the Severan era worth studying? At its most basic, it's a relatively short period, only around 40 years, and yet it's chock full of warfare, plotting, intrigue, and all the other juicy bits that would make for a superb HBO miniseries. So if anybody out there watching happens to be an executive, there's a historical consultant in the wings, just saying. The Severans are also great, though, for considering multiple ways in which imperial power could be achieved or seized and maintained, and even how it was conceptualized at the highest level. This is all the more valuable owing to the fact that the Severan era represents something of a hinge point in imperial history. Should it be conceived of as the last chapter of the High Empire, that is to say, when Rome's imperial expanse was at its zenith and the empire was internally, relatively speaking, stable and peaceful? Should it instead perhaps be classed as the opening salvo of the crisis of the 3rd century, where soldier emperors fought with one another and enjoyed only brief reigns before being overthrown in turn? This question has been complicated in the past, owing to some highly questionable takes, usually prompted by later writers' contemporary concerns. Notable examples of this are Edward Gibbon's accusations of the Severans barbarizing the empire, obviously prompted by Gibbon's own predominantly racial prejudices during the colonial era. And Michael Rostovtsev's later claim that the Severans ushered in a period, a damaging overthrow of a settled bourgeoisie by a rural proletariat. No surprises there that that's perhaps based more on Rostovtsev's own experience of fleeing the Russian Revolution than anything to do with the Severans themselves. In many ways, the Severan era sees the continuation of Rome's imperial structures and institutions founded by Octavian Augustus and refined and developed by subsequent rulers. While aspects of Roman government do change, for example, we can identify a shift in power from the Italian heartland to the provinces, and from senatorial office holders to a rising equestrian class, these are gradual changes and not sudden shifts. It would be wrong to think of the Severans arriving on the scene and throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What is more apparent, however, is that each of the rulers of this dynasty are challenged to develop and present their imperial personal power in varying ways. And it's this element I'd like to chat about with you today. We'll start with the dynasty's founder, Septimius Severus, considering how he contorted his personal and family images to build an almost all-encompassing sense of imperial legitimacy. We'll then move on to his eldest son and successor, the infamously violent Caracalla, whose murder of his younger brother prompted a wholesale reevaluation of what it meant to be a Severan emperor. We'll close by looking at the young Elagabalus, another name perhaps familiar to some of you. In this section, we'll consider the boy emperor's use of religion in his public image, as well as the role of the imperial women underpinning the Severan dynasty as a whole. I'll close off this presentation with a slide of some book recommendations for you to take forward, should this frenetic and slightly chaotic sometimes period catch your interest in the way that it has mine. So it's worth thinking very briefly before we go on about the nature of the ancient evidence that we have at our disposal for the Severan era. In material terms, we possess a great deal of coinage and other official media, from sculpture through to architecture, which Suzanne Luznia will be talking on next in this series. It's also the height of the epigraphic habit, meaning that we have a relative wealth of ancient inscriptions dating to the period. Our surviving literary sources, however, are relatively few and often leave a lot to be desired. Most important is the historian Cassius Dio, who was a senator for the majority of this period. His massive 80-book Roman history is arguably the most valuable source that we possess for the period, but it should be noted that Dio writes with a passionate dislike of the military and any emperors whom he considers favoured the army. His history is therefore largely hostile and oppositional to the Severan emperors. It should also be noted that Dio's history was preserved and transmitted through the work of various monks during subsequent centuries, who actively condensed or epitomized the original text. Now, moving on, Herodian is more enigmatic. We don't really know much about him compared to Dio, but we can surmise that he was a near contemporary of the period. His work, detailing the history of the period following the death of Marcus Aurelius, is written from a position looking back at the events with a sense of real detachment. He's considered of questionable reliability and quality in areas, though, and is sometimes accused of parroting the official version of events released by the imperial household. Our final big key source, and certainly this isn't an exhaustive list, is the infamous Historia Augusta. This is a set of 30 biographies, similar in style to those of Suetonius, whom you might be familiar with, containing lives of each of the Severan emperors. Aside from the fact that these were written much later, nearly 2 centuries, almost every facet of this source is controversial, from the question of whether it had one or multiple authors, to questions surrounding its fundamental purpose as a body of work. The Historia Augusta is notoriously unreliable and difficult to use, often, for example, injecting entirely fictionalized characters into the narrative. In short, we need to exercise real caution before accepting anything that these written sources tell us. In the case of Dio and Herodian, moreover, we need to consider these as writers in a new era, a new frontier I've put on the slide. As well as creating political shockwaves, the collapse of the Antonine household and with the death of Commodus effectively destroys the idea of consensus between mankind and the gods, between the ruler and the governed, that permeated the writings and literary output of the 2nd century CE. Like the emperors themselves, writers therefore were trying to conceptualize the Roman state and its history afresh, something we need to bear in mind when criticizing them as much as when we engage with them. So let's get into our case studies properly then, beginning with the dynasty's founder, Septimius Severus. Severus rose to power in the tumultuous year 193, sometimes referred to as the year of the 5 emperors. Commodus had been murdered in the final moments of 192 and was followed by 2 short-lived regimes, those of Pertinax and Didius Julianus. Pertinax was an austere favourite of the Senate, who possessed a wealth of experience in military and government roles prior to his accession, and yet he was murdered by the Praetorian Guard after only 86 days. Julianus, by contrast, was a relatively obscure senator who is infamous for offering the Praetorians a ginormous donative payment in return for their favour, thus winning the throne in the episode sometimes referred to as the Auction of the Empire. His regime, however, would only last 66 days before he was declared a public enemy, abandoned by his guards, and murdered in the imperial palace. So what binds these two apparently opposite men together? And why is it important for thinking about Septimius Severus? In very brief terms, both of these men failed to craft a compelling narrative of their rule, and thus failed to create a convincing sense of their personal legitimacy. A bit of this is slightly chicken and egg, of course. Both men didn't get all that much time to develop their own personal image. Pertinax certainly wouldn't have known that he was going to die after 86 days, since he succeeded emperors who had ruled or had measured their rules in decades rather than months. His rather bland statements about giving the Senate more authority, though, meant nothing to the vast majority of his subjects. Julianus perhaps should have been more clever or more careful, should have known better given his predecessor's fate, but his regime was ultimately similarly narrow in focus, only this time fixed on the Praetorian Guard rather than any other constituency. Julianus's downfall was also accelerated by Septimius Severus, who raised his standard in opposition quickly and marched on Rome from Upper Pannonia, a province bordering the river Danube. His invasion of Italy in force meant that even the Praetorians saw little future in defending their recent patron after a short while. So, where his predecessors had failed to construct personal narratives of what their rule was all about, Severus himself proved to be far more wily and pragmatic. Indeed, the one question that we would be forgiven for asking in this early period, at least, is who actually is Severus? In the early months of his rebellion against Julianus and his installation as emperor, Severus successfully weaponized the memory of the slain Pertinax. He cast the murder as a dreadful crime, successfully painting himself as something of an avenger. You might be able to pick out here on the slide on the coin that I've shared here that the fact that Severus actually adopted the name Pertinax into his formal official titles. The abbreviation Pert can be seen just above the emperor's brow there on the coin. He went further, though, deifying Pertinax and releasing more coins declaring the slain emperor Divus Pertinax Pius Pater, divine Pertinax, pious father. This not only served to tie Severus, who had no imperial connections prior, to an emperor, but it also gave his early regime a singular sense of urgency and focus, something which was comprehensible across the social spectrum. This was particularly valuable in the context of Severus having to fight off a challenge from the governor of Syria, Pescennius Niger, who had also been proclaimed emperor by his troops. This isn't the end of the story, though, since Severus's claim to imperial power became even more contorted in 195, when the Pertinacian elements were largely replaced by a new claim, this time that he was in fact the legitimate successor of the Antonine household, son of Marcus Aurelius and brother to Commodus. This was uncharted territory, and Dio scathingly claims that a senator at the time made a pointed joke about Severus's ancestry. The quote here is on the slide. It allowed Severus to lay claim to a much longer tradition, though, something which would carry a lot of weight given the high regard felt for Marcus across different social strata. Severus's chameleon-esque self-presentation is impressive in its own right, but in truth, it was only one part in a much wider campaign of legitimation and control, which was actually remarkably multifaceted, but for the sake of brevity today, I think can be divided into roughly 4 broad pillars. The first and arguably most important pillar of Severan imperial power was family. We've already seen part of this pillar in action, with Septimius associating himself with other family lines. But the other facet to this was the promotion of Severus's own family as a stable unit, which guaranteed a smooth transition of power to hereditary successors. This is seen in various ways. Septimius's sons, Caracalla and Geta, are presented in their younger years as almost indistinguishable from one another. And while Geta would have to wait for around a decade longer than his older brother, both sons eventually became co-emperors alongside their father. They feature prominently on coinage, the closest thing we have to a mass media during this era, usually with legends telling everybody how fortunate the empire is to have them. Here on this golden aureus that I've shared on the slide, for example, we see the boys flanking their mother, Julia Domna, and the coin legend declaring Felicitas Saeculi, the good fortune of the age. Beyond the visual language of the regime, however, the family were also prominent in public events and grand displays, such as the secular games of 204, which brings me on to the next pillar of narrative building, spectacle. As I mentioned earlier, Suzanne Luznia, a global expert on the Severan building program, will be talking to you soon, so I won't dive into too much detail here. But I talked just now about how the image of the family permeated media such as coinage. If you were a citizen of Rome, chances are you would be bombarded with other imagery, stressing just how fantastic the Severan family really was. Part of Severan magnanimity in this area was in restoring a number of old structures that were either in a state of disrepair or had been damaged in the Great Fire at the end of Commodus's reign in 191. These structures included the famous Pantheon and structures in the Roman Forum. This served a dual benefit for Severus. It allowed him to cast himself as Restitutor Urbis, the restorer of the city, a title which stressed his personal connection to the physical environment of the capital and to its people. It also allowed him, however, to insert his own family into the historical tapestry of the city. This is most visibly seen nowadays in the placement of the Severan triumphal arch in the heart of the Roman Forum, but in those early years of the 3rd century, there were many other projects ongoing, including the monumental nymphaeum, that is to say, a monument consecrated to the nymphs, known as the Septisodium. And it's not just in Rome where we see this kind of activity taking place either. At sites across the empire, particularly in North Africa, from where the Severans hailed, we see a growth in buildings and structures being erected. Historically, there has been some debate on what constituted imperial building work versus what was thrown up by local populations keen to stress their loyalty or in the expectation of some kind of imperial benefaction. This is an important discussion, to be sure, to have on a case-by-case basis, but for our purposes today, that fact is almost secondary. Whether structures were put up by the imperial family personally or their closest adherents and supporters in the provinces, the underlying message of unity and stability still permeated diverse communities across the empire. The family members were also active in making themselves physically visible, moreover, by engaging in imperial tours across the provinces, mainly in the eastern half of the empire. These forged something of a personal connection between the ruler and the ruled, and thereby lent further stability to those regions. Another key pillar of Severan early rule, after all, in this respect, had been the reorganization of these eastern provinces, creating a new Roman province of Mesopotamia and dividing the old province of Pescennius Niger in Syria, remember his early rival in civil war, into 2 administrative areas, divide and conquer. And this point brings us to something of the elephant in the room, I think, that Severan power was, like nearly every imperial regime, founded on military strength. Perhaps the most unambiguous example of this is his treatment of the Praetorian Guard on his arrival in Rome in 193. In response to the Praetorians' murder of Pertinax and abandonment of Julianus, he simply cashiered the guard entirely and replaced them with the men from his own legions. Added to this, Severus created 3 new legions in the context of his eastern travels and campaigns against neighboring Parthia, and yet stationed one of them only around 20 miles from Rome itself. He furthermore raised the military wage for the first time in around a century. As I say, There was no ambiguity concerning the basis of Severan imperial power from an early stage. Despite all of this future-proofing of the dynasty, however, across these different pillars and more, it was to be the most precious pillar of control for Severus that was to falter, his own family, the nuclear family unit. This brings us on to Severus's eldest son, a contestant for the angriest man in Rome prize, the Emperor Caracalla. And here I am having a scowling contest with the man himself. Let's just move on from that slide. Born in 188, Caracalla was named Severus's heir apparent in 195, triggering the final civil war between Severus and the then governor of Britain, Clodius Albinus. Caracalla was eventually made co-Augustus with his father in the early days of 198, in a move probably timed to draw a link between the boy and the Emperor Trajan, even then commonly renowned in antiquity as the Optimus Princeps, the best emperor. Now, Caracalla is commonly remembered as an unhinged, violent militarist, most infamous for the murder of his younger brother at the close of 211, following years of building acrimony. In the interest of time, I won't read the full account here offered by Cassius Dio, so please do pause the slide if you want to read it in full. But suffice to say that our surviving sources agree on the brutality of the attack and the duplicity of Caracalla in luring his younger brother into meeting in their mother's apartments before striking the fatal blow. To murder one's own brother is bad enough on human terms, but it carried just as weighty a political significance for Caracalla and the Severan cause at large. Caracalla had eliminated not just his brother, but his colleague in office, and had no heir to succeed him. He had been married in his teens in a union arranged by his father and the ill-fated Praetorian prefect Plotianus, Caracalla wedding the latter's daughter, Plautilla. The marriage was an abject failure, though, and the bride was exiled in 205 when her father was implicated in a failed coup d'etat. Incidentally, Plautilla would herself be murdered in the aftermath of Geta's death. The murder of Geta thus threatened the fragile stability of the Severan family unit as a whole, as an entity. Now, it's been argued in the past that this act ultimately destroyed the Severan dynasty for these reasons. There may be some basis to the argument in very general terms, but this is perhaps too simplistic, and it doesn't account for the various ways that Caracalla pressed his own sense of legitimacy, nor the fact that he was able to rule successfully for a further 5 years after the fact. Now, these, to my mind, again, are the sort of core pillars of Caracalla's rule. Obviously, murdering Geta meant that it would be impossible for Caracalla to continue the lovey-dovey family image pursued by his father. That said, it would also be incorrect to say that he had to abandon all notion of the dynasty or become anti-dynastic in the way that some have argued. Instead, it appears that Caracalla was compelled to tread a very careful line, anchoring his legitimacy to the regime of the past, while changing its justifications and presentation in other areas. It's worth noting here that Caracalla, like his father, was not changing the empire on an organizational level. He continues policies commenced by his father. There's no major change of the institutions that make the empire work on a daily basis. Now, moving on, Caracalla's post-mortem treatment of his brother is almost as notorious as the murder itself. He subjected Geta to the process referred to as damnatio memoriae, effectively obliterating all public mention of him. This is renowned as the most virulent example of this practice during the Roman imperial period, and for that reason it's sometimes seen as something other or altogether different or outlandish. The fact remains, however, that while the extent of it is striking, the practice was well established by the early 3rd century as a way of both condemning one's political enemies as well as providing an obvious warning to any would-be opponents. As we'll see in a moment, this was part of a wider process of rewriting Geta's role and place within the history of the Severan family. Like his father before him, spectacle and public building works form a core pillar of Caracalla's attempts to legitimize his regime. The best known structure from this period, although it was potentially conceived earlier, is the colossal baths of Caracalla near the Circus Maximus in Rome. One modern attempt to cost the bath complex put the final figure at around 1.2 billion sesterces for its completion, so colossal in every scale. The other largely continuous pillar pursued by Caracalla from Severus was, of course, the military. Caracalla raises the army wage by a further 50% and spends the majority of his sole reign with the army, levying forces and then launching an invasion of the Parthian Empire once again. So far, so normal. One area where we begin to see some kind of forward development, though, with the move from Severus to Caracalla, is in the latter's relationship with the divine. Given his love of all things military, we might expect Caracalla to double down on that and military themes to dominate all of his official kind of output on coinage, etc. This isn't exactly what happens, though. Instead, what we see is a large-scale increase in religious themes and iconography. While emperors evoking religious themes and support for the regime is not in itself unusual, since we have to remember that they did push the conceit that they could become gods after their death, after all, it's the extent of Caracalla's devotion here that makes it potentially unusual. Like the damnatio of Geta, this is potentially because it was partially weaponized into a new narrative, which changed the story of Caracalla and Geta from indivisible brothers into a struggle between good versus evil, with the gods divinely protecting and sanctioning Caracalla's rule. Now, at the most radical end of Caracalla's new regime is undoubtedly his constitutional reform, with his great edict, the Constitutio Antoniniana, sometimes known as the Antonine Constitution. Issued around mid-212, this act changes the legal landscape of the Roman state entirely in one sweep, bestowing the rights of Roman citizenship onto nearly every free person living in the realm. From what we can restore of the text, it seems clear that it was phrased as an act of religious thanksgiving, an act designed to repay the gods for their protection and support of his life and rule. But we might also see here an attempt to achieve something of religious consensus, harking back to the idea of that consensus between man and gods, between emperor and subjects, that had been shattered by the collapse of the Antonine household. It's safe to say that nearly every aspect of this edict is couched in debate or controversy. Contrary to previous notions, citizenship was still a pretty exclusive club in 212. So this was not simply a throwaway act designed to rubber stamp an already finished process. It was a truly significant constitutional shift. In fact, one could say it created a new normal. Despite the apparent significance of it, though, the historical echo of the edict is curiously small. We possess only one contemporary copy of the text, and even this is a private Greek copy of a presumably Latin original. Also, as you can see from the picture that I provided, the papyrus that we do have containing the text, now housed in Gießen in Germany, is in a very sorry state indeed. Now, setting aside all of these myriad problems with it as a source and its physicality, etc., the most important question for our purposes is why? Why this act at this time? We have to think about Caracalla's situation in the early months of 212. He had just committed an unprecedented act of murder. He had no heir to succeed him, and while his relationship with the army seemed cordial enough, he was more unpopular with the senators than his father had ever been. And even then, that's not saying all that much. Put simply, Caracalla's regime was arguably at its most vulnerable point, with his murderous actions only eroding his potential support base even further. The Antonine Constitution, then, was an elegant solution to this problem, inasmuch as it forged a direct link between Caracalla and his new citizens, akin to a patron-client relationship on a colossal scale. On an individual level, such an act of beneficence usually carried an expectation of reciprocity between the two parties, and it was likely no different here, albeit the quid pro quo on the part of the newly enfranchised was likely taxation, as well as a degree of goodwill towards this fragile regime. Now, despite the mixture of the old and the new taking place under Caracalla and his re-evaluation entirely of the Severan past, Caracalla would meet his death in an almost traditional way, quote unquote, murdered by his own praetorians whilst on campaign. Owing to the lack of a child or sibling to succeed Caracalla, this creates a power vacuum, which is initially filled by the architect of the assassination, the Praetorian prefect Macrinus. This regime, the first man of equestrian status to hold the throne, is short-lived though. It's intensely unpopular with nearly every constituency. It's stuck in the field and is soon toppled by a resurgent Severan cause with the 14-year-old boy Varius Avitus Bassianus, known to us as Elagabalus, at its head. Now, the rise of Elagabalus heralds an important change in the Severan dynasty, since the boy's claim rested not on his connection to Septimius Severus, but rather to his wife, Julia Domna. Elagabalus was the grandson of Domna's sister, Julia Maesa. Now, this is where things tend to get a little bit complicated with the names, since all the important women in the Severan line are called Julia. I'll discuss the importance of the Severan women shortly, but suffice to say that there may have been some wariness about pressing Caracalla's first cousin, once removed, as a truly legitimate successor to the slain emperor. This can be seen in the claim found in Cassius Dio that Maesa and others circulated a rumor that Caracalla had in fact slept with his cousin, Elagabalus's mother, Julia Soemias, and thus Elagabalus was in fact Caracalla's illegitimate son. It's doubtful how far this can be accepted as written, given Dio's problems as a source. Even if it was the case that Maesa and co tried to infer a bloodline between Elagabalus and Caracalla, it still remains open how far such a link was meant to be taken literally, rather than as an openly political conceit designed to emphasize Macrinus's utter lack of bona fides. So let's move on to Elagabalus himself. Elagabalus is a name that is perhaps familiar to some of you nowadays, owing to the fact that his character and reputation have been subject to wildly varying interpretations across centuries. Our ancient sources tend to condemn the young emperor on two primary grounds: his sexuality and his religious devotion. So on the subject first of his sexuality, if we read between the lines of our surviving texts, it's eminently possible that Elagabalus truly desired to change sex, or was at the very least gender fluid. The surviving sources, being written by conservative men from the social or monetary elite of imperial society, however, mean that this is often couched in wrongful terms of deviant behavior, although mercifully there have been far more measured responses to this topic during the modern era. Allegations of supposed sexual misconduct were an easy way for ancient writers to denigrate an unpopular emperor, since the Augustus was supposed to embody the Roman manly virtue of virtus. That's fairly easily set to one side then. We have to look more deeply, though, at the question of his religiosity. The young ruler had been inducted into the priesthood of the god Elagabal prior to the Severan resurgence. In typical fashion, our sources revel in gratuitous details about the supposed rites and ceremonies conducted by Elagabalus in the name of his patron deity. One example from Herodian is included on the slide. Pause again if you want to read it in full. Unlike the question of Elagabalus' sexual orientation, which was largely a private affair though, his religious devotion was unquestionably a public facet of his reign, particularly from the year 220 onwards. In addition to worshipping the god personally, Elagabalus injected his chosen god into the traditional Roman pantheon in a number of ways, building temples and edifices, assuming the title of summus sacerdos, high priest, and perhaps even trying to engineer some kind of marriage between his god Elagabal, which had solar qualities, and the lunar goddess Urania. Now on the slide, you can see an example of just how public and important Elagabalus's religious identity was. We see an aureus of around 219 here, with a triumphal quadriga, a four-horse chariot, but rather than the emperor standing victoriously or triumphantly in it, what we see instead is the black rock of Emesa, the avatar of the god Elagabal. The legend Sancto Deo Soli Elagabalo, the holy sun god Elagabal, leaves the consumer in no doubt as to the entity being championed. What are we actually seeing here, though? It's often difficult to see through the vitriol of the sources, but I would suggest that it's possible to see here something of the same desire for consensus and unity that we might see also in Caracalla's Antonine constitution. On a fundamental level, this might be interpreted as a continuation of the propaganda concerning divine protection and providence, which had been kick-started by Caracalla. After all, Caracalla was the emperor from whom Elagabalus nominally claimed descent. While we cannot and should not dismiss the idea of genuine religious devotion on the part of Elagabalus himself, we should also not allow ourselves to be swept away with the narratives constructed by ancient writers who are hostile and thereby dismiss everything out of hand. Now, it's fair to say that Elagabalus' popularity waned over the course of his 4-year rule. Religious eccentricity paired with serial monogamy, married 4 times to 3 different women, one of whom was a Vestal Virgin, as I said, HBO. All of this combined to leave his regime vulnerable. The Severan response, engineered in part by his grandmother Maesa, was for Elagabalus to adopt his cousin, the boy who would become known to us as Severus Alexander. It was quickly apparent that Alexander was more popular than the emperor, in part at least because the evidence suggests that he was being groomed as a more palatable successor. Elagabalus appears to have become increasingly troubled by this and attempted to eliminate Alexander on multiple occasions. After a final bungled event in 222, the Praetorians finally snapped and mutinied. In a dramatic turn of events, various imperial family members end up in the Praetorian camp, decrying one another's cause. Now, notably, it was Elagabalus and Alexander's mothers, not the boys themselves, leading the loudest cries. The Praetorians swiftly made their decision for Alexander's camp, and the result was the violent murder of Elagabalus, then still only aged 18, and Julius Soemias. I include Dio's version of the graphic violence here on the slide. The presence of Elagabalus' mother at the fatal endgame in 222 is of some importance, since the young emperor's personal unpopularity is still only really half the picture. No consideration of the Severan era, however cursory, would be complete without a brief discussion of the family's imperial women. These women embody one area where the Severans arguably depart most radically from their predecessors, inasmuch as the women were continually prominent and, as the dynasty progressed, appear to have exercised increasing personal agency and maybe even actual political power, although it should be stated here that it is often very difficult to differentiate between the idea of influence and so-called soft power versus the ability to affect physical change under one's own auspices. Regardless of where you think the line on that question should be drawn, though, each of the women on this slide had an important effect on the way that the Severan dynasty played out. So let's work from left to right, starting on the left with Julia Domna, wife of Septimius Severus, mother to Caracalla and Geta. She is regarded as the, quote, maternal guarantor of the imperial family, really the anvil upon which the dynasty is founded. We can only speculate on how the relationship with Caracalla was affected by the murder of Geta, of course, but the evidence confirms that she played an even more active role in his court in the years following, even managing some of his imperial correspondence while Caracalla was out on campaign. If Julia Domna was the dynasty's anvil, moving right to Julia Maesa, Maesa may well be both its sword and its bank. We might agonize over how best to describe Maesa's power, but the fact remains that it was she who organized and bankrolled the Severan counter-revolution after Caracalla's murder. She might also even have been present during the climactic battle near Antioch, which secured Elagabalus' throne. Thereafter, she was clearly a power behind that throne, instrumental in trying to engineer a solution to Elagabalus' waning popularity across different social groups. The mothers of Elagabalus and Severus Alexander, the remaining 2 Julias, Julia Soemias and Julia Mamea, are harder to define, since much of their efforts seem to have focused on pushing their respective sons during that period where Elagabalus' regime began to fragment and fall apart. Soemias potentially pushed Elagabalus' religious program hard, while Mamea appears to have postured her son, as we've said, as the traditional alternative to her nephew. Even in this more combative environment, though, both women appear to have been recognized as key influences in their own right. Now, overall, The women have been accused of all manner of social and sexual misdemeanors, but this is rather self-evidently the result of a hostile Roman male reaction to women at the highest social echelon, a prejudice given further life by similarly misogynistic writers throughout the colonial and Victorian eras in particular. As with other famous women throughout history, we are still unpicking much of this baggage today. Reflecting on their role in the Severan regime once more, however, their extensive influence throughout the period is pretty comprehensible if we consider that Severus's regime was founded on the fecundity of Domna for starters, and that the death of Caracalla brought the male line screeching to a halt. The later Severan emperors claimed their legitimacy through their maternal relatives, even if they did dress it up using other fictive genealogies. So, by way of conclusion to this whistle-stop tour, it would only be proper to give you a sense of how the dynasty ended. Elagabalus' murder resulted in the simultaneous promotion of Alexander Severus, who by that point had been made the heir apparent. He would rule for a further 12.5 years before meeting his own violent end. I'm ending the main slideshow here with this coin to show you that while it's imperative that we critique our literary sources, often the material evidence that survives is equally unreliable. Here we have a coin from Alexander from the mid-220s, with the reverse proudly proclaiming Fides Militum, the loyalty of the army. Even a cursory look at Alexander's reign confirms that he was about as far from a natural soldier as one is likely to get. His regime was actually pretty well suited to domestic affairs. He engaged in moderate economic reform and was generally seen as inoffensive and moderate, even with the figure of his mother, Julia Mamaea, prominent in the picture. Alexander comes unstuck, however, owing to a series of foreign affair crises. The rot begins to set in following his rather muted response to an invasion by Rome's new enemy to the east, the Sassanid or Sasanian Persian Empire. Alexander launched a campaign with great pomp, but the actual fighting was rather underwhelming and approaching disastrous in a couple of areas potentially. While the frontier itself was stabilized, his reputation had been hurt and he had perhaps been spooked by the conflict. It's little surprise then that when he's faced with unrest on the northern frontier shortly afterwards, he elects to pursue a more measured and diplomatic response. Looking back with 2,000 years of hindsight, it seems a perfectly reasonable option, but it was an intensely unpopular move with the army of the day, and tensions reached boiling point. Alexander and his mother were initially arrested by the soldiery before being murdered in their encampment near Mainz in Germany. Once again, the presence of the emperor's mother at the point of his death seems significant. But we must also be wary of the way in which ancient writers choose to depict the close relationships between the ill-fated Severan emperors and their mothers. This is one area that I plan to delve into a little bit more in future research. In any event, with this murder, the Severan dynasty finally runs out of family members and comes crashing down. Alexander was replaced in the field by a rather large cavalry officer known to us as Maximinus Thrax, ushering in a pattern of barrack room emperors. He would only rule for 3 years before being toppled himself, commencing around 50 years of nearly continual civil conflict until Diocletian finally managed to apply the brakes with the introduction of the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, 2 senior emperors and 2 subordinates. At the start of this presentation, I noted the question of whether the Severans represented the end of one era or the beginning of another. In truth, I don't think I've got a pithy answer for you. In some ways, the abruptness of the rules which follow the Severans leads for an argument that we should interpret them as the end of the High Empire. By that same token, however, 50 years of short reigns, when set against the larger centuries-long span of the empire, might lead you to question whether we should really contemplate this as a terribly significant break, or whether we should even call this a crisis at all. Whatever it is, I think it's intensely Roman in character. And so that's what leads me to perhaps downplay this idea of it being an all-encompassing crisis. While I reject firmly the notion that the Severans barbarized the empire, both owing to its racialist undertones and the historical facts, as I've shown, that the Severans are in many ways agents of continuity with the Roman past, I think that the question of what the Severans represent must depend on what historical questions you're trying to answer. And I, for one, think it's actually exciting that the question remains open. And I hope that you might feel emboldened to delve into the era more yourselves to start answering questions just like that. So I promised a slide of book recommendations, and here it is. This is far from exhaustive. It doesn't even cover all of the great English language books out there, let alone those in other languages or the vast array of short articles out there. But it is a decent mixture of the broad and the detailed, I think, if any of you are interested in starting your own journey with this rather dramatic and dysfunctional family. Pause here if you want to note any of them down. All that remains then is for me to thank you so very much for your time and attention. For too long, the Severan era was overlooked in favor of the Julio-Claudians, Flavians, or Constantinians. That tide is changing though, and I hope that more people will come to see this period for all the excitement and the drama that it contains. Thank you very much indeed.